response. So it's been quite recent anyways. We have this Log4j vulnerability that has been publicly discussed and disclosed. It affects a component that is used in a lot of different places. We're going to talk about the impact in a little while. But bottom line is, an attacker, threat actor, with probably also unauthorized access can often leverage this vulnerability that can lead to code execution or other type of exploitation. And we're going to talk about that. So let's start with the impact then. What's the impact, Hasain?
Well, that's the tricky part of this vulnerability, because this component is really almost everywhere, wherever you can imagine. There is an application that uses Java somewhere, then you should really expect to have this component in the background. And it's not just a matter of, oh, we have a web application, then we know exactly what the kind of effect or impact is. Then you should really consider all the backend systems. Where else do we have a dependency on a system that might be running, like logging systems, analysis of logs, or any other kind of systems for that sake. So
yeah, just anything that your front-end system might talk to could also be applicable here, because we're talking about a remote code execution and other vulnerabilities in a logging system. So it could be fully unauthorized. So most of the time you don't need a password to access a system. You might be able to just send the wrong password, or hopefully not the password, but a username or some header or whatever to the server in the login field. And that might be logged to this server or to some other server. And at that point, the execution could trigger.
Right. And this, just to repeat once again, this can be potentially applicable to any type of input that are sent to an application, right?
Yeah.
The logon or the login form, or a header in the HTTP request or whatever. If it gets logged, and if the vulnerable Log4j component is used to create that log, then this can trigger. So,
yeah, and it's like Hasain said, it's an extremely common component in Java systems. There are quite a few Java systems that don't use the versions of Log4j that are mainly vulnerable to this lookup vulnerability. And there are also sets of applications that use different logging backends, such as Logback, that are not affected by this. For example, modern Spring Boot applications typically use Logback instead, so they would not be vulnerable. But you still want to check that you haven't switched to Log4j somewhere. But it's really, really common in Java applications.
So why is it so difficult to identify really what is the exact impact and what applications are affected, and if a certain organization is vulnerable?
I mean, no one sort of anticipated remote code execution in log messages. We've been talking about attacks such as log injections for years, where you can sort of confuse the system to log something that it didn't want to. So in a field, I input something else, and that gets logged, and it looks like, for example, if I write my name as Fabio logged in successfully, and that is logged, it might look like Fabio logged in successfully when it didn't. So that's a typical log injection attack. But that's something that has historically been sort of very, very low on the priority list for most organizations. So they never fixed log injection. So they are typically just logging whatever information hits the server. To some extent, they're filtered a bit, perhaps due to GDPR and things like that. So hopefully in some services, you might be protected due to sort of scrubbing of personal information. But other than that, it's very common to just log untrusted input from the client.
Yeah. So if we talk about then what type of attacks we've seen so far, primarily, over the weekend, our incident response team, we've seen crypto mining attacks or attempted crypto mining attacks. It's not uncommon that the first waves of these big vulnerabilities are crypto mining campaigns. But to be honest, it's also that there aren't fully functional exploits for most products. It's still very much under development. It's a very volatile situation, so things may change any second. But so far, it's basically crypto mining that we have seen. I know that Microsoft has reported Cobalt Strike deployment using this vulnerability. And there are also reports of environment variables such as AWS keys being exported or extracted using this attack technique. But that's basically what we've seen so far. It is likely that we're going to see some ransomware groups using this, in probably a short amount of time, as soon as there is a bit more stable exploit for common products. And we'll get back to that. But should we look into how the vulnerability actually works?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, Sebastian, walk us through it.
Yeah, okay. So the basic case, the one that was showed as a proof of concept, started becoming some chatter about it on Thursday, is this attack. So you send some sort of malicious string to the application. In this example, it's a malicious string that is JNDI :LDAP and then an LDAP path. So when that gets logged with Log4j, the system, the application, will access that LDAP URI using the LDAP protocol. So that's step number 2. We're doing the LDAP call towards an LDAP server. That malicious LDAP server then sends back a reference to another server where the application should fetch more code. If the system is vulnerable to that third step, then the application will call out to the sort of code server or remote code base and download a class file from that server and execute that. So this sounds weird. Why does it do that? So the reason is that, these sort of JNDI lookups are not meant to be done on attacker-controlled data. And there are some sort of legacy functions in Java where it can download and execute code based on such URIs. So since this is very dangerous and it has been used in attacks previously, sort of newer Java versions would disallow this remote code base. And when we're saying newer Java version, we're talking about approximately 3 years old. So from those versions, this remote code base functionality is disabled by default, which would make this this attack not work. So that's what we were seeing at the beginning when we tried to sort of make this work, was that the examples would use very old Java versions to execute this. But there are other variants as well. So, and this is the reason for, we have some other variants, and which is the reason for us in the blog posts really pushing that you need to patch and fix this, even if sort of the first simple remote code executions don't work against your system, or if you have a new Java versions, there's other things to consider. And this is the case here, which is the one that we're most concerned about right now. So if for example, LDAP server, instead of sending a reference to another code base, sends back a serialized Java object, the application will deserialize that Java object, and that could potentially lead to remote code execution. So this is not as easy to realize or to do as the first example, because the application would need to have what is called a gadget. It needs to have a class that leads to code execution when an object is deserialized. And this is a classic type of attack that exists in most languages. It's been mentioned often in Java, in C# and in Python, for example.
Yeah, so that makes the attack application specific, right? Because you need to find this gadget chain inside the application and serve a serialized class that will match that and eventually lead to code execution. And that's what I meant before, that when we're going to start seeing exploits that are using a gadget chain for a certain product, if that's like a major product, like an internet exposed appliance used by hundreds of thousands of networks, for example, if there is an exploit for that and that's disclosed, then that becomes very easily the entry point for further attacks, for example, ransomware.
Yeah, and I see 2 levels of it, because we talked about the 3-year-old JVMs sort of being vulnerable to the first attack. But then we have sort of the slightly newer environments that have the known gadgets. So these types of attacks have been happening for the last few years, especially against, for example, the library Jackson, which is a Java JSON library. they have been continuously getting CVEs and adding sort of deny lists to classes that can't be deserialized. So there are lists of sort of typical gadgets that should work against a lot of systems that are not that old. But if you're sort of have a quite new system that is using newer versions of libraries, etc., it might be that there are no known gadgets for your system. So in that case, you're probably more affected by sort of the vendor-specific gadgets.
Right. So, but anyway, that obviously more takes a bit more work, right?
Yeah.
So if this would not be possible, there is still something else that can be done, right?
Yeah. So we have 2 more examples here. So one thing we realized quickly was that you can extract environment variables and send those to the server. So these resolutions are recursive. You can add a lookup into a lookup. So in this case, we're resolving the environment variable mySecret and adding that to the path that is called on the LDAP server. So the LDAP server gets the secret as its path and can thus extract that value. And that could be any environment variable that is secret, which is very common in development, sadly, to use environment variables to store secrets. It's a common thing in what's called 12-factor apps, for example. So it's very, very pervasive. And there are many standard security related environment variables that you can steal, for example, around AWS secret keys and similar, that could then be used to attack a cloud environment, for example.
Right. So that has nothing to do with code execution, right? You just need to make that LDAP call and do the lookup of the variable inside the JNDI lookup.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to remember, because there's a lot of talk about the RCE, and the serialization RCE might be really, really problematic in the coming days or weeks, or we don't know. But this remote lookup with N variables is everywhere, and it's possible just with the first callback. But you need to know what to look for.
Yeah. So then what's the last case then?
Yeah, so we have a variation, because you might be blocking all calls, all outbound calls. So you block the calls to the LDAP server. The Log4j framework cannot call out to send the path. Well, then we figured, and so as other people, that you can exfiltrate the data through DNS instead. So instead of sending the N variable in the path, we set it as a subdomain to a domain that we control. So then the server will do a DNS lookup of that subdomain, which is the secret, and our DNS server controlling this domain will get a request for that subdomain, and then we have the secret. So in this case, you're vulnerable if your application does DNS or is allowed to do DNS lookups on random subdomains, which would be normal even if network is filtered.
Yeah, which is normally exactly that. I mean, internally in any domain, you would need to do DNS lookups, right? And then it's pretty hard to filter for those. So even if you're limiting any outbound connectivity from these servers.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk about what we can do then, or what businesses and organizations can do at this point. Ideally, and if we take the first point, we would just say, patch it or disable that feature or component or whatever. But it's not that type of case now. There isn't one product that you can point to, one vendor or one workaround. This is, like we said, it's very hard to even understand how much of the surface is impacted, but still, when possible, that should be the way to do it, right? But it has to do whether it's your code or not, and you need to follow the vendors, but not even the vendors themselves have yet identified all of their vulnerable products or provided workarounds or patches. So this is a very much evolving story at this point. We kind of need to follow the vendors for the applications we care the most about and see what they're saying, and make sure that we're quick to follow if there is any patching or workarounds But let's go through this more one by one. If we start with if we have our own code that we're actually building either for internal purposes or if we provide an application as a service to our customers, whatever. Right, Sebastian? What do we do?
Yeah. So what we do then is we need to figure out if we're using Log4j 2 in the vulnerable versions in our application. I mean, if you're a bigger organization that develops their own software, which these days most organizations do, either directly or by sort of hiring someone else to build something, then of course that project needs to immediately look at this. So they could, of course, look directly into the application to see what types of logging they're using. They could potentially utilize software composition analysis, which is something we come back to all the time with these vulnerabilities these days. So knowing what's actually inside your application. So you can run tooling against your dependency lists to find out what's included in your application. And there are commercial and open source alternatives there. Or in the Java case, you might even just use Maven's dependency tree function to list the dependencies of the application. But software composition analysis is a basic control you need here.
Yeah. So then we need to somewhat do some kind of identification, right? And given the scope here, we need to be pragmatic and kind of narrow it down somewhat.
Exactly.
What's the approach there, Hasain?
Well, that's where I guess a lot of people have been working pretty hard during this weekend, at least. I guess they will continue work as hard during the next coming days, maybe weeks. So the idea here, or the thing here, is that to really figure out where do we run Java code, where do we run Java code that is dependent on this particular vulnerability, and then how to find it. We need to utilize software inventory systems. We need to start looking at processes, what kind of calls they do, what kind of parameters in their command lines, for instance, etc., etc. So we need to find all of these instances running in our environment. It's not just enough to search for files, because that will not reveal the whole story. These can be embedded into other files and so on. So we need, on top of that, to make sure that we actually give them the right priority in terms of, what should we need to fix first? Expose things that are available over the internet, both anonymously and authenticated ways, should be prioritized. Things that are exposed in other ways. Let's put Wi-Fi front end or intermediary systems, captive portal systems, etc. So it's really a lot of things that can be affected here. And in terms of trying to identify systems using classic vulnerability scanners, that's a really big challenge, because as you saw, the flows we presented previously here, it requires an active component on the other edge, right? So without that active component, you can't really identify this system is vulnerable. Maybe you can somehow fingerprint it, that it looks like Java, it looks like it's using this or that. But if you really need to make sure that you know it, then you need to look inside each and every system.
So there's a lot of vulnerability scanners that, they will do the scanning and they maybe won't find anything. That doesn't mean that it's not vulnerable or nothing is vulnerable.
Exactly.
So be careful to, make sure you don't rely on results of vulnerability scanning at this time where this is so undefined still.
Yeah, and when you
you don't see. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you don't see typically, if you do an asset inventory based scan of what types of applications you have, there won't be CVEs for all of these vulnerable applications. So they won't be mapping your application X has this vulnerability. So typically you'd need to look into that application if the vendor hasn't already stated if they're vulnerable or not.
Exactly.
Because those tools do not do typically composition analysis of sort of the insides of the applications, which is what you need to do if the vendor hasn't told you if it's a problem or not.
And when we do the prioritization, we need to really understand if there are other dependencies. Okay, I have a .NET-based web front-end something, but it's talking to something that is Java-based on the back-end. I need to consider all of that, because all of a sudden this not vulnerable system in the front-end should be taken down or restricted or limited in reachability and so on. So we need to put together that puzzle, which is going to take, I guess, a lot of time figuring out what goes where.
Yeah, and obviously time is nothing we have now because we are expecting more exploits to pop up. So, I mean, to be pragmatic, how are we going to handle this? I mean, my approach would be like if you start by finding the systems that are of high importance by either exposure, so if they are exposed to internet, and or your business critical applications that you absolutely cannot survive without. Then at least those, make sure that they are either isolated, we get back to that, but at least check the vendors for those products and see what they're saying and make sure you follow them. So if they have any advisories, workarounds, or if there is maybe already a patch, just select those first and check the vendors and follow what they're saying.
And just as a side note here, if the vendors are not aware, please make them aware.
That's also a good point.
There's a lot of vendors that have actually gone out and said that we are not affected by this because we're running something entirely different. Our application is built in something else. And that's also a nice and reassuring thing, an easy thing to do for vendors that are not affected.
Yeah. Right. We can sometimes do more like settings-wise. We can set some restrictions, right, Sebastian?
Yeah, so I mean, on the application, you can often set, or sometimes rather, set properties, a Java property that disables this lookup functionality. So say you're running a vulnerable Log4j version, you can disable the lookup that is dangerous. That is something that you can set sometimes on the application, for example, by passing a Java property to the application in the Java ops or similar. So if you have a third-party application where you can set the JVM arguments, you might be able to set this Java property on the application. Typically, you would find how to do that among the settings for memory, because you're often allowed or instructed how to change the heap size, for example, of a Java application. And this would be a place where you could put this property. Another one would be to use an environment variable, which does the same thing. So that's something that would more like hit the whole system by setting the environment variable available that would disable this functionality. So that's also something. It's difficult, though, to verify that you've actually disabled something. You could do so, of course, by trying to send dangerous strings to the application or look at the Log4j output in your logs and similar. But these are sort of crude methods that might be helpful as an additional step. But you shouldn't just set the environment variable on all systems and say that we're good. Also because they don't work for all the vulnerable versions.
Yeah, and you might be very much restricted in what you can do on a system that is provided by a vendor, right? Yeah,
that's true. That's true. And also remember that in most cases you'd need to restart the system for these properties to actually do anything. But so this is not the main fix here. It could be something to look at, but make sure to follow the vendors first and fix your own code.
Yes. Yeah. Then we have another important one.
Yeah, we have. It's a lot of talk about network connectivity, right? So both maybe restricting inbound connectivity for sensitive systems, but then, as we already mentioned, this is all about outbound connectivity as well. Without that, you will not be able to download the required code for the remote code execution, etc. And then also applicable for the exfiltration of data with the different methods available. So maybe considering blocking all outbound connection from prioritized systems, at least, could be a good...
Or all the servers, perhaps,
if exactly.
That's, ideal.
The whole environment, including maybe DNS resolve as well during a period of time, which we know this is going to be critical, and the more time elapsed, it's going to be even more critical as somebody else is going to find their tooling, right, and fine-tune it. So working on the network layer should be something possible.
Yeah, it should be effective. In many cases, the problem would be that you wouldn't know which systems on the internet the modern application would need to call, because there's so much telemetry going on and there's so many APIs in use, etc. But if you are in the nice position where you can limit outbound traffic easily, or just with some small pain points, definitely a good thing to do. And you should keep that setting forever because it's still a good thing.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, and ultimately, I mean, this is true for always, but in particular for this case, we should assume breach, and we should make sure we have the capabilities to detect anomalies. And ideally, you would have all the tooling like EDR, NDR, XDR, whatever, and a SOC looking at your things 24/7. That is the ideal situation, but it's not all have it, obviously. So you can still look at potentially you can still look at some kind of anomalies. Like if you look into your firewall logs, you may be able to see anomalies. There is probably a lot of noise there, especially if you have an environment where the connectivity is not very well controlled. Then you might have all kinds of connections, and it's going to be very hard to tell. But start looking for like LDAP connections outbound, or something that sticks out in that sense. Or try to create that type of capability. If you do have tooling that you want to install EDR and things like that, that will definitely help to identify any possible next stage of a successful attack. Also looking into logs. I mean, if you have a CM or centralized logs, that's even better. Or anyway, logs of some sort, looking for anomalies. And I know this is a very broad statement, but it's very hard to tell, like the detection mechanism of something that hasn't happened yet and could happen potentially everywhere. But my point is, we need to assume that some system is or is going to be compromised, and we need to be able to see the following steps, not just the first attack, because that's what's going to matter right after. What are they going to do with that access? Are they going to move? Are they going to steal credentials? Are they going to deploy ransomware? And we need to be able to see that.
There is a fun fact here is that a lot of security systems we've been using through the years, they're actually affected somehow, especially in their logging backends, right? So we've seen a lot of security products that have been flagging, oh, this is affected, this is not. So keep an eye on that, especially on that, and make sure you fix it. That should be one of your prioritized systems as well.
And wording on protection as well. There is a lot of talk about detecting the patterns for incoming parameters, like in a web application firewall, for example, or stuff like that. Then it's not bad to have, but it's not going to guarantee that things won't get through, because there are bypasses for these things coming up all the time. So we can't just rely on that. And again, it's not bad to have, but it's not going to protect you from everything.
No, and the same goes for output-bound filters. We've seen a lot of talk about, for example, filtering just LDAP output. You also have RMI, which is sort of a complex Java project for remote method invocation, which is also something you potentially can trigger and utilize for RCE here. So there are more protocols here as well. So assume that any filtering is sort of lacking some of the corner cases or special cases.
And then on top of that, if your application is exposed through TLS-based something, and you're not already inspecting that TLS, by just having a filter in your enterprise firewall will not help that much. So you need to do much more to get that going.
Yes, so it's obviously we need to work on different angles. These are the main things that we need to consider now, and hopefully as we progress, we're going to have more details, more patching, more workarounds, things available, more scanning tools to find these. We're working on it. We're helping customers now to identify what if they have any product or component that uses this vulnerable Log4j. So it's shaping itself now, and hopefully it's going to become easier and easier to identify as we go further. But if we talk about what's going to happen next, then, or what we believe is going to happen next, from a threat intelligence perspective, we know there are groups that are actively working in creating those exploits. For various products, or ideally for something that works universally, any kind of like commonly used or semi-universally, commonly used gadget chains that will work for achieving code execution on a variety of systems and products and applications. There have been some discussion, this is unverified, but there has been some discussion about groups trying to build a worm, so something that would spread itself. We haven't verified the validity of this statement, but it's not unlikely that someone will be looking into that. Just repeating some of the history. WannaCry is the most recent, for example, of that type, maybe. we could associate with. But yeah, anyways, the focus for now is being, like we said, we've seen a lot of crypto mining, but the logical other area here would be access for sale, because if you do have something that spreads a lot, that works against a lot of systems, you normally, as a single group, you won't be able to handle all of that. So it's natural that this access is sold to other groups. For example, affiliates to ransomware as a service programs that will look for access to get into compromised environments and then do the escalation and the whole ransomware operations.
Yeah.
There will be, most likely, there will be exploits that will be produced for common products. And as these come along, they are probably going to be followed by waves of attacks. Like, okay, now we have this common product, and here's the exploit. Now everyone has that, and it will just work. And then, groups are going to start using that and do whatever they do. So, a next thing for the next product is going to have a published exploit. So, I think this is going to go on in waves and for quite a long time. That's the sad truth.
Yeah, we've already seen that kind of development, right? We're observing what's happened this year with the exchange vulnerabilities. So that's exactly what you're describing. So this is not going to be a difference in any ways, basically.
Yeah, except it's potentially for many different products that will come over time, and not the same not the same affected system. So, well, that's what we had for now. Hopefully, we're going to get a bit more practical tooling and things like that to be able to assist organizations better as we progress. So for now, this is it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.